بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم ما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. When my slaves ask you about me, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, inform them that I am near. This is a verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. Imam al-Tabari, rahimahullah, great mufassir, he says that people came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam asking, Ain Allah? Like, where is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We want to know where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So the answer that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave is not regarding His location. Because it's obvious, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of locations. He's not going to be encompassed by His own creation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in answering this question, the erroneous question, where is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not encompassed in a where. We cannot fathom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns their attention towards that which is more important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ, I am near. Near in the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears us, He sees us, He is aware of our condition. The ayah continues, أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. When a caller calls upon me, I will answer that call. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي. So you should call upon me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and you should believe in me. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. Perhaps they will achieve righteousness, guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam how to respond to people when they ask about Allah. So they ask, how is Allah? Where is Allah? The answer is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is near. He knows everything about you. Because He knows everything about you, He sees everything, He hears everything, you should resort to Him. You should ask Him for help. There's two commandments here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي. Ask me and believe in me. Allah is near, believe in that. Believe that Allah can see you. Believe that Allah hears you. Believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of your condition. And number two, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you have this belief that Allah is always watching, He knows what's happening, He is the one that created you, He is the one that created this entire universe, He can take care of anything, anytime He wants, and you know you have a relationship with this Creator, then you should ask this Creator. Now, why should we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? There's a very beautiful hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually talks to us about the nature of Allah. And this hadith will show you and I why we should attempt to make dua to Him. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam says in a hadith narrated by Abu Dawood, Inna rabbakum tabaraka wa ta'ala hayyun kareem. Indeed, your Rabb, your Lord, the Most High, and he uses a word where, the scholars of belief, that they're very careful in what we attribute to Allah. But the word he uses, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is bashful. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't resemble human beings. So what this word means is something beyond our intellect. But he says Allah is bashful and He's noble. Bashful meaning like you get embarrassed because of some things. But you'll see in the hadith what it means. يَسْتَحْيِي مِنْ عَبْدِهِ إِذَا رَفَعَ يَدَيْهِ إِلَيْهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has haya. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has modesty, as what befits His jalal and His majesty. When His slave lifts their hands towards Him, and they're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to the word of the hadith, is bashful that He does not leave the slave's hands empty. أَنْ يَرُدَّهُمَا صِفْرًا. He doesn't want to leave the slave empty-handed if he makes dua. So this is very beautiful hadith. And again, I emphasize, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not resemble human beings. He's not shameful the way we have shame. The way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is mentioning here is saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you lift your hands to Him and you're going to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's not going to leave it empty-handed. That's what it means. What does this mean for you and I? It's a free ask. All you have to do is lift your hands, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will not leave you empty-handed. This is the power of dua. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying in that ayah in Baqarah, when my slaves ask you about me, I'm near, tell them to make dua. It doesn't make sense that you will get free things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you don't attempt it. You and I ask many people for things. We ask people for favors. We go to work because we require certain things. We ask our bosses for leave. We ask many people for help. That help that we may receive from them is muhtamal. There's a chance we may receive it. There's a chance we will get rejected. But in this hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is noble. He will not leave your hands empty-handed. If you lift your hands in dua and you beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will be different after that dua than you were before. What is dua? We all know what dua means. Imam Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, he says, هو إظهار غاية التذلل والافتقار إلى الله والاستكانة له. Dua is to manifest the heights of humility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you lift your hands to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and sometimes we're kind of mindless in our acts of worship, so we may not feel this because we've lost the connection with ibadah. But if you lift your hands to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'm going to mention some etiquettes, you display how you are lesser, how you are weak, how you are muftaqir and completely in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that moment. That is what dua is. It is to exhibit and manifest your weakness before the Creator, and then you ask Him and He will give you, inshaAllah. Why should you and I make dua? First of all, it's a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Surah Ghafir, verse 60. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمُ دُعُونِي أَسْتَجِبَ لَكُمْ. Your Lord has said, make dua to me, I will answer you. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ عَنْ عِبَادَتِي سَيَدْخُلُونَ جَهَنَّمَ دَاخِرِينَ. Those who are too arrogant to do my ibadah. And in this context, those who are too arrogant to make dua to me will enter Jahannam humiliated. If you are so arrogant that you cannot lift your hands and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah promises you will enter the fire of Jahannam humiliated. Meaning you have to humble yourself. In dua, humility is part of it. Similar to salah. If you think about what we're doing in salah, if our minds and our hearts are engaged, we will realize that I have to bow, I have to put my head on the ground. This is the heights of humility. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants that from you and I, that we realize His greatness and we also realize our weakness. In one hadith narrated by Imam al-Tirmidhi, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, مَنْ لَمْ يَسْأَلِ اللَّهَ يَغْضَبْ عَلَيْهِ. Anyone who does not ask Allah, Allah becomes upset with that person. Allah is actually upset when you do not ask. How amazing it is that Allah is such that if you don't ask Allah, He becomes upset. And all of humanity is such, the more you ask them, the more they get upset. We are very lucky and fortunate that Allah, the more you ask Allah, the more pleased He becomes. The more dua you make to Allah, the more He is going to answer and the more happy He becomes with you. Which is the total opposite of humanity. Now I'm going to talk about etiquettes of dua, how to do dua, inshallah. We all know the importance of dua. Some of us are missing this element in our life. We are only causing loss for ourselves. We have an opportunity to get free things from Allah if we ask Allah, if we take out the time on a daily basis, and we're missing that chance if we're not doing it. So we All of us, myself included, need to have a daily time period where we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala whatever we want. Now, since dua is such an important aspect in our deen, there's going to be prerequisites to a dua. There's going to be some etiquettes to the dua. There are some do's and don'ts. Inshallah, I will share some of those with you right now. As for the prerequisites for dua, what's a prerequisite? If you do not have the prerequisite, don't even bother engaging. Right? So there are some things about dua. If you're not going to have these conditions beforehand, it's likely your dua is not going to be accepted. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be rejected completely, but there is a chance, a likely chance, as what Rasulullah has taught us, that the dua will not be accepted. So a prerequisite to dua is that our lives must be halal. Our lives must be halal. What does this mean, that you have a halal life? In a hadith, I believe is recorded in Sahih Muslim, Rasulullah paints a picture for us of this traveler. He has disheveled clothing, dusty clothing, disheveled hair, and all of the elements of acceptance of a dua are there. He's humble, he has nothing around, he's desperate. As we will talk about, these are conditions that really strengthen the dua. He has all of the signs of dua. He lifts his hands and he begs Allah. He says, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi. Oh my Lord, please, please. He's begging. So anyone who's watching this person would say, this person's dua is definitely going to get accepted. Rasulullah says, however, this person's food is haram. The clothes that they're wearing is purchased with haram money. Everything about them is haram. Wudiya bil haram. He's been raised with haram. He's been nurtured with haram. فَأَنَّا يُسْتَجَابُ لَهُ. How in the world will Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept such a dua? You and I, if we're engaged in haram, we are engaged in an act of rebellion against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we lift our hands, it is likely that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not accept at that moment. So this is a prerequisite that everything we consume, the money that we earn, our lifestyles should be halal. And I know you as well as I, we want our du'as to be accepted. There's no question about it. So if it's important to you, you're going to look at your life, find what is haram, and eliminate that. Inshallah, that is the prerequisite for du'a. Now, what are some etiquettes of du'a itself? I'm going to talk about certain things you do before the du'a, certain things you do during the du'a, how to actually do a du'a, and then an aspect regarding after the du'a or what not to do. Number one, what to do before the du'a. Some etiquettes. Choose the best time for du'a. Now, what does this mean, best time for du'a? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His favor and grace upon us, has given us special moments throughout every single day and different opportunities that we encounter where du'as are going to be more accepted than normal. It's not that du'as are not accepted only in those times. Du'a is going to be accepted anytime you raise your hands, inshallah. There are certain selected moments in our lives where du'as are more readily accepted, such as tahajjud time. This is the last third of the night. If you take the entire night from after, let's say, Isha till Fajr, and cut it into 3 portions, that last third, if you make dua at that time when most of the creation is sleeping, it is more likely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept the dua. Another chance that we're missing, between adhan and iqamah. Every time you're in the masjid and the adhan was called, there's usually about 15 minutes between the adhan and the iqamah, meaning the start of the salah. That time is very special. It is a time of ijabah, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepting dua. During iftar, if we're fasting, and that is why it's highly emphasized that you and I make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before breaking the fast. How unfortunate in Ramadan, the whole family is together and we're just talking and discussing different things, which is great, but that is the moment where du'as are going to be accepted. We can talk after iftar. And in general, in general, after any good deed. That is why you may see people right after salah, lift their hands and they make dua, because salah is a great deed, one of the best deeds. So after any good deed, you gave sadaqah, it's a good time to make dua. You perform 2 rak'ahs, nafal, fard, whatever it is, it's a good time to make dua. You fasted, make dua. You just gave your zakat, go to a corner, make some dua. Any good deed, make some dua after that. So that is the first etiquette. Choose the best time. And for our daily lives, choose a time that works for you. What is good for you? When are you free? Maybe before going to sleep, you can squeeze in 5 minutes. Maybe after Salatul Fajr, you have a few minutes. Perform a dua at that time. You should have a daily time where you do dua. Number 2, be in the state of wudu. This is an etiquette. It's not compulsory. So if someone doesn't have wudu, they can make dua. Okay, but it's very good to be in the state of wudu. There is this hadith that Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, his friend passed away. He was murdered in a battle. Before he died, he asked Abu Musa al-Ash'ari to relay his salam to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and ask him to make dua of forgiveness for me. He says, ask Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to do istighfar for me. And then he died. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he goes to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he mentions that Abu Amr, he asked you for this and then he died. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, bring me some water. He brought the water to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam performed a fresh wudu. Then he lifted his hands and he made dua of istighfar for Abu Amr over and over again. Which tells us the etiquette for dua is you should be in a state of wudu. You can still do it if you're not in a state of wudu. Number 3, face the qibla. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would also face the qibla in the battle of Badr when he made this dua that, oh Allah, these are your slaves. If they are murdered, if they are killed and they lose this battle, you will not be worshipped on earth. He was facing the qibla and his hands were lifted towards the sky. And etiquette number 4, lift your hands towards the sky. Now, what does this mean when you lift your hands? What's the significance? We need to be aware of these postures in our acts of worship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the acts of ibadah so beautiful that they encompass different levels of the human psyche. Salah could just be recitation. We could just say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, walking around and do salah. But it's more important than that. Our bodies are also engaged. Why? Because when you think about it, it will create more humility. When you lift your hands, you are mimicking the beggar. You act as a beggar before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, irrespective of your position, how much money you have, your status in society. You sit down and you are before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, lifting your hands up towards Him, showing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you are absolutely nothing. You also put your gaze downward and not upward, and you make a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the significance of lifting the hands towards the sky. It shows how destitute and weak we are. So those are some etiquettes before the dua. Again, choose the best time for dua. And really, the most, I would say that the absolute best time is what works for you, what you can be consistent upon. Number 2, have wudu. Number 3, face the qibla. Number 4, lift the hands in the dua. So this is before. Of course, there's many more etiquettes. Now I'm going to talk about how to do dua. The first thing you and I have to have in dua, if you want your dua to be accepted, is focus. Tawajjuh, focus. How often we lift our hands, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً. You don't even know what you're saying. You don't really care. If you don't care about your dua, Allah doesn't care about your dua. So start caring about your dua. Focus on what you're saying. If you don't know the meanings of these are very powerful duas because they're in the Quran, they're also in the Sunnah. So I still recommend you recite these duas, but also have a portion where you speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you observe the statements of the prophets in the Quran, when the Anbiya alayhimus salatu wasalam used to make dua, they would talk to Allah. Look in the beginning of Surah Maryam, where Zakaria alayhi salam, he's speaking to Allah. He's saying, oh Allah, I'm weak. Oh Allah, I'm afraid. Oh Allah, I need your help. This entire discussion is happening. We need to open our hearts up before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and explain. Ya'qub alayhi salam, Surah Yusuf, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. I only complain of my situation to Allah. He complains to Allah. What do? We complain to each other and we don't say anything to Allah. Complaint should be directed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So focus. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one hadith, he says, اعلموا أن الله لا يستجيب دعاء من قلب غافل له. Understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not accept the dua of a ghafil heart, a negligent heart that is not focused. Allah won't accept it. So if you're not going to focus in your dua, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to listen to it. He hears it, He's not going to answer it. Now, that is the thing that we need to do when we lift our hands in dua. Focus. Really have your heart attached to it. Number 2, start with praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending salutations upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In one hadith, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he witnessed this person sitting and making dua. This person performed 2 rak'ah salah, and then he raised his hands. He said, Allahumma ghfirli warhamni. Oh Allah, forgive me and have mercy on me. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw this person. He said, you rushed. You did it too quick. Rather, when you sit to make dua, praise Allah and send salutations upon me. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam says to this person. Then you make your dua. So he teaches us the etiquette of dua. You don't just say, oh Allah, give me this, oh Allah, give me that. You start off in a beautiful fashion. The best way to start something with the praises of Allah. Try to praise Allah according to your capacity. You know something about Allah that you can say to praise Allah. The least we can say, oh Allah, you are the creator of the heavens and the earth. Oh Allah, you know me better than I know myself. Oh Allah, you put me in this situation. Oh Allah, everything that good I have in my life, you gave to me. Oh Allah, you are the most powerful. You have no wife, you have no children, you have no creator. You are the creator. These are all praises of Allah. This is how you start the dua. Then you move on to salutations upon Rasulullah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. This is a very brief salutation. Then you ask Allah. This is the etiquette of dua, how we start the dua. A third thing that we should focus on, learn the names of Allah. The 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are very powerful. Alhamdulillah, we know the greatest name of Allah, Allah. But there's many other names. And understand the meanings of these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Depending on what you want, use the relevant name of Allah. It will increase the power of your dua. Oh Allah, I want an increase in wealth, in halal money. It's not wrong to ask for halal money. Ask for it all the time. Ya Razzaq, urzuqni. Oh giver of sustenance, give me sustenance. So you use the relevant name of Allah. If you are seeking Allah's forgiveness, Ya Ghafir, Ya Ghaffar, Ya Afu, Ya Tawwab, Ya Wadud. These are names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they accentuate the content of your dua. So we need to learn the names of Allah and start actively using them in our du'as. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَدُعُوهُ بِهَا. Allah has the most beautiful names, so call Him with those names. It's a command from Allah. How many names of Allah do we know? We know Rahman, Rahim, Malik. Learn some more inshallah. 99 names. There's actually more than that. Another etiquette during our dua. Repeat your dua in a desperate manner. Be desperate before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some say as desperate as a person who's about to drown. How desperate would a person be in that situation? And it is sunnah to repeat your du'as, the same one, 3 times. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would repeat that du'a 3 times. Oh Allah, forgive me. Oh Allah, forgive me. Oh Allah, forgive me. Try your best to cry. And Umar radiallahu anhu says, if you can't cry, pretend to cry. Pretend to cry. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will create those feelings. In an ayah of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Udu'u rabbakum tadarru'an wa khufya. Call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with humility, with desperation, and do it in a humble tone. Don't be loud, lower your voice. Call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a very fearful voice, with a very humble voice, with seeking His love and assistance. And the last thing that I'll mention regarding the dua, the etiquettes of dua, is have conviction that your dua is accepted. Do not be a person who after the dua, you're like, why would Allah accept this dua? He's not going to accept my dua. Then he won't. Rather, be the person who says, Allah will accept my dua. I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance. It is incorrect for you and I to think that you have done a sin that Allah cannot forgive. It's actually kufr, disbelief. To think your sin is so great that Allah, who is Akbar, cannot forgive it, that's disbelief. Doesn't matter what you've done. There is a hadith, the person who killed 100 people, it says he killed 99 people. He went to a monk, he said, will Allah forgive me? He said, no, he killed that guy too. 100 people he killed. Then he went to a scholar, he said, will Allah forgive me? He says, yes. And the conclusion of the hadith is Allah forgave him. So you definitely did not do that. Now, that is the general etiquette. I'm going to summarize, inshallah, and we'll conclude here. We need to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether you're in a good situation or not. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one hadith, he says, if someone wants Allah to accept their du'as in times of difficulty, they need to be someone who makes dua in times of ease as well. Dua is an act of worship, it's not just a request. So you and I have to do dua even if we're in a good situation. So we make dua to Allah to exhibit our slavery to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you and I are nothing before Him. That is why we have to do it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala likes for us to make dua and He'll accept. What should we do in a dua? Choose the best time to make dua, usually tahajjud time or after a good deed. Try to be in a state of wudu, face the qibla, lift your hands in the dua. When you're making a dua, focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Realize who you're talking to. Imagine that you are being watched. Now, we don't make an image of Allah in our minds. That is not correct, because Allah is beyond all of that. Just imagine that you're being watched by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine yourself making the dua. Focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We start with praising Allah and we send salutations upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then we begin with the dua itself. We start requesting Allah. How do we request Allah? Ask for the best things of the dunya and akhirah first. Start with the akhirah. Oh Allah, give me Jannatul Firdaus. Now some of us, naturally, you feel shy. How can I ask for Jannatul Firdaus? Like, I know who I am and I'm absolutely nothing. How could I ask for Jannatul Firdaus where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is going to be? Where the Anbiya are going to be? Well, it's a hack. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us, when you ask Allah for Jannah, ask for Firdaus. You don't deserve it, but He can give it. So that should be the mindset. So we ask Allah for the most important things: Jannah, salvation from Jahannam, afiyah, wellness, good health, halal rizq and sustenance. Then you go down the list. One thing I would highly suggest, because a lot of people struggle with dua, we can't even make dua for 1 minute. Have a dua list. Get a sheet of paper, write the most important things that you want in your life. Inshallah, you have that before you, and sit with it. Have it with you. There's no problem. It's not like it's going to ruin your dua. You can't read Quran out loud like that in salah, like have it open like that, according to some madhahib. But for dua, you can have a sheet of paper with you. So I suggest that. So you make your du'as, you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you finish off the way you started, with the praises of Allah and with the salutations and peace upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we need to start making more dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and remember the prerequisite. Highlight what haram things we have in our life and eliminate those things. Insha'Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will start accepting our dua. I again repeat that one hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is hayyun kareem. He is noble, and He doesn't want to leave His slaves' hands empty when they make dua. So remember this about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and remove this mindset that you and I are ashamed to make dua. I've done so many sins, how can I make dua? That is shaitan's whisperings. When you do a sin, shaitan will come and say, you making dua to Allah, how dare you? You don't deserve it. Well, shaitan, he's trying to cast you astray with him. So make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ready to accept. We ask Allah for tawfiq to make dua to Him and the acceptance of the dua. وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.